When plantation records from the Savannah River Valley were finally unsealed in 1983, archivists discovered something that contradicted every assumption about antebellum Georgia. A single cabin on the Hartwell estate, home to a woman described in ledgers only as the Mulatto Rose, contained architectural features that defied the brutal logic of slavery. Hand-carved moldings, a brick fireplace with decorative ironwork, glass windows with curtains, and a locked trunk filled with items no enslaved person should possess. The discovery raised questions officials refused to answer for decades. What they found inside that cabin in 1851 would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Georgia society, a web of deception so intricate that 5 men would die to protect it, and a truth so disturbing that the surviving Hartwell descendants paid to have the records buried again. Before we continue with the story of Rose and the cabin that became her prison and her weapon, we need you to be part of this investigation. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from. Your engagement helps us uncover more forgotten mysteries like this one. Now let us go back to a humid spring morning in Burke County, Georgia, when everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The Hartwell plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of fertile soil along the Savannah River, 20 miles southwest of Augusta. In 1851, it was one of the most prosperous estates in Burke County, producing cotton, tobacco, and rice through the labor of 143 enslaved people. The main house stood on a slight elevation, a 2-story Greek revival structure with white columns that caught the morning sun. Magnolia trees lined the approach, their waxy flowers perfuming the air each spring. Thomas Hartwell had inherited the property from his father in 1843. At 38, he was considered a progressive planter by his peers, which meant he preferred psychological control to the whip, though he would use violence when necessary. He kept meticulous records, attended church every Sunday, and served on the county agricultural board. His wife, Catherine, was the daughter of a Charleston merchant and brought both refinement and social connections to the marriage. They had 2 children, Richard, 14, already learning estate management, and Anne, 11, who spent her days with needlework and French lessons. The enslaved population lived in 2 rows of cabins behind the main house, each structure housing between 6 and 10 people. The cabins were identical, single rooms with dirt floors, gaps between the wooden planks that let in rain and cold, shared fireplaces made of mud and sticks. Families received weekly rations of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses. They worked from dawn until dark during planting and harvest, slightly shorter hours in winter. Hartwell allowed them Sunday afternoons for their own purposes, which he considered generous, but one cabin stood apart. It sat at the end of the western row, separated from the others by perhaps 30 feet. From the outside, it appeared no different than its neighbors, though closer inspection revealed subtle distinctions. The wood was newer, the roof better maintained, the door hung straighter on its hinges. A small vegetable garden grew beside it, something none of the other cabins possessed. Most notable was what it lacked: the constant flow of people, the noise of children, the sounds of communal life. Only one person lived there. Rose had arrived at Hartwell Plantation in the summer of 1848, purchased at an estate sale in Augusta. The seller's ledger described her as mulatto female, approximately 18 years, house-trained, exceptional appearance, no visible scars. Thomas Hartwell paid $850 for her, nearly 3 times the average price for a female field hand. His wife had not accompanied him to the sale. The other enslaved people noticed Rose immediately. Her skin was the color of honey in sunlight, her features delicate, her hair long and curling when not tied back. She moved with a grace that seemed cultivated rather than natural, and she could read, something that became apparent when she was seen examining the labels on medicine bottles in the main house. Her speech carried no regional accent, suggesting education or time spent among white families in a northern city. Thomas Hartwell assigned her to work in the main house initially, assisting with sewing and light cleaning. But within 2 weeks, he announced a change. Rose would live in her own cabin and perform specialized duties for the family. The nature of these duties was never clearly stated. She no longer appeared in the main house regularly, yet she was not assigned to fieldwork. She received better clothing than the other enslaved women, fabric that suggested personal selection rather than mass distribution. Her weekly rations included items others never saw: white flour, fresh butter, coffee beans, white sugar. The whispers started within a month. Some of the enslaved women claimed they saw Thomas Hartwell visiting Rose's cabin after dark. Others said Catherine Hartwell's face had grown rigid whenever Rose's name was mentioned. The overseer, a German immigrant named Klaus Fischer, seemed to have been instructed never to enter Rose's cabin or discipline her for any reason. When one of the field hands made a crude comment about Rose within Fischer's hearing, the man received 15 lashes and was sold to a plantation in South Carolina within the week. The isolation might have been unbearable for some, but Rose accepted it with an expression that revealed nothing. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words were measured and polite. She attended no gatherings, formed no friendships, participated in none of the small acts of resistance and solidarity that helped the enslaved community survive. To the others, she became a ghost, a beautiful mystery who moved between her cabin and some unspoken arrangement with the master. But Rose was watching everything. She observed the plantation's rhythms. When the overseer made his rounds, when Thomas Hartwell met with neighboring planters, when Catherine Hartwell took her afternoon rest, when the household slaves gathered to gossip, she noted who held real power and who merely performed it, who could be trusted and who would betray confidence for favor. She was building a map of the estate's hidden architecture, the invisible structures of fear and control that held the system together. In her cabin at night, by the light of the oil lamp Hartwell had provided, Rose wrote in a journal she kept hidden beneath a floorboard she had carefully loosened. The journal was a dangerous possession, but Rose had learned that the most effective weapons were often the ones that seemed harmless until the moment they were needed. On the morning of April 3, 1851, Catherine Hartwell did not come down for breakfast. This was unusual enough that Thomas sent one of the house slaves, an older woman named Dinah, to check on his wife. Dinah knocked on the bedroom door, received no answer, and entered to find Catherine lying in bed, her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. She was breathing, but she did not respond when Dinah spoke her name. The doctor was summoned from Augusta, a ride of nearly 2 hours. Dr. Samuel Winthrop had attended to the Hartwell family for 15 years. He examined Catherine thoroughly while Thomas waited in the hallway, hands clasped behind his back. After 30 minutes, Winthrop emerged with an expression of professional concern. "A nervous condition," he announced, "brought on by excessive worry and perhaps improper diet. She needs complete rest, reduced stimulation, and a tonic I will prepare." Thomas nodded, accepting this diagnosis without question. In 1851 Georgia, women's ailments were often attributed to their delicate constitutions, and physicians had learned to provide explanations that satisfied husbands without requiring deeper investigation. But that evening, after the doctor had departed and the household had settled into an uneasy quiet, Thomas made an unusual request. He sent for Rose. She arrived at the main house just after sunset, entering through the back door as instructed. Thomas met her in his study, a room lined with books he rarely read, and agricultural journals he studied carefully. He closed the door behind her. "Mrs. Hartwell is unwell," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "She requires care beyond what Dinah can provide. You have a gentle manner and a steady hand. You will attend to her during her recovery." Rose kept her eyes lowered, as expected. "Yes, sir." "You understand, this is a position of trust," Thomas continued. "You will sleep in the small room adjacent to her bedroom. You will see to her needs, administer her medicine, and report any changes in her condition directly to me. You will speak of this arrangement to no one." "I understand, sir." Thomas studied her for a long moment, and something flickered across his face. Calculation, perhaps, or worry poorly concealed. Catherine has been under strain. She has been saying things that are not rational. If she speaks to you of matters that seem confused or fanciful, you are not to repeat them. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." He dismissed her with a wave, and Rose climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the family bedrooms were located. The small room Thomas had mentioned was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, but it had a window and a door that closed. Compared to the cabin, it was luxurious. Catherine Hartwell lay in her bed, her blonde hair spread across the pillow, her hands folded atop the coverlet. Her eyes were open, but they did not track Rose's movement as she entered the room. "Mrs. Hartwell," Rose said softly, "I am here to care for you." For a long moment there was no response. Then Catherine's eyes slowly focused on Rose's face. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and what she said made Rose's blood turn cold. "He killed her. You look just like her. He killed my sister, and now he has brought you here to remind me." Rose maintained her expression of calm servitude, but her mind was racing. She had heard no mention of Catherine having a sister. The Hartwell family history, as understood by the enslaved community, included no such tragedy. "You should rest, Ma'am," Rose said, approaching with a cloth dampened in lavender water. "The doctor said you need to rest." Catherine's hand shot out with surprising speed, gripping Rose's wrist. Her fingers were thin but strong, and her eyes had gained a clarity that seemed to contradict her earlier vacancy. "You do not understand," Catherine whispered urgently. "He will do the same to you. He cannot help himself. I have tried to warn others, but they put me in bed and call me hysterical. You must leave this house. You must run while you still can." Before Rose could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Catherine's grip released immediately, and her expression dissolved back into blankness. Thomas entered the room, carrying a glass of dark liquid. "Her medicine," he said, handing it to Rose. "See that she drinks all of it." Rose took the glass and helped Catherine sit up enough to drink. The liquid smelled of laudanum and other herbs. Catherine swallowed obediently, and within minutes her eyelids grew heavy. Thomas watched until his wife slipped into sleep, then gestured for Rose to follow him into the hallway. "As I said, she speaks irrationally. You will ignore anything she says that does not pertain to her immediate comfort. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." Thomas descended the stairs, and Rose returned to the small room adjacent to Catherine's. She did not sleep. Instead, she sat in the darkness, listening to Catherine's steady breathing, and thinking about a dead sister no one had mentioned, about Catherine's desperate warning, about the way Thomas Hartwell's voice had changed when he spoke of his wife's words. Something terrible had happened in this house, and whatever it was, Catherine Hartwell believed it would happen again. The next morning, Rose began searching for answers. Rose had been taught to move through spaces without drawing attention, a survival skill cultivated over years of navigating white households where visibility could mean danger. Now, as she attended to Catherine Hartwell's needs, bringing food that went mostly uneaten, changing bedclothes, reading aloud from devotional books, she also observed everything else. The Hartwell house revealed itself in layers. The public rooms downstairs displayed careful respectability. Furniture imported from Charleston, paintings of pastoral scenes, a piano in the parlor that Anne practiced on each afternoon. But the private spaces told different stories. Catherine's bedroom contained a locked cabinet that Rose was forbidden to open. Through a gap in the door, she glimpsed what appeared to be letters tied with black ribbon. On the mantelpiece sat a daguerreotype in a silver frame, positioned so it faced the bed. The image showed two young women in identical dresses, their faces so similar they could only be sisters. One of them was clearly Catherine, perhaps 10 years younger. The other woman shared her features but had darker hair and a more serious expression. Rose waited until Thomas had left for a meeting with his cotton factor in Augusta. Catherine was sleeping under the influence of her medicine. The house slaves were occupied with their daily tasks. Rose carefully removed the daguerreotype from its frame. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Catherine and Louisa Pemberton, Charleston, 1839. Louisa, the sister Catherine had mentioned. Rose replaced the daguerreotype and moved to the locked cabinet. She had learned lock-picking from the enslaved man in Virginia who had been a skilled carpenter before his capture, and who had taught several of the women practical skills that white owners assumed they could never acquire. The lock was simple, designed to discourage curiosity rather than prevent determined intrusion. Inside, Rose found the letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Catherine in a flowing hand. She selected one at random and read, "Dearest sister, I write with news that will surely surprise you. Mr. Hartwell has asked Father for permission to call on me formally. You know my reservations about plantation life, but he seems a sincere gentleman, and Father believes it an excellent match. I confess some excitement despite my hesitations. Please write and tell me what you think of this development. Your loving sister, Louisa." Rose read several more letters, watching a courtship develop through careful prose. Louisa Pemberton had been engaged to marry Thomas Hartwell in 1841. The letters spoke of wedding preparations, of Louisa's mixed feelings about leaving Charleston for rural Georgia, of Catherine's apparent encouragement of the match. Then the letters stopped. The final one was dated November 7th, 1841, just 2 weeks before the scheduled wedding. Louisa wrote of last-minute details and her nervousness about married life. There was no indication of any problem, no foreshadowing of tragedy. Rose searched the cabinet thoroughly but found nothing else. No letter explaining what had happened to Louisa. No obituary, no wedding announcement. It was as if the woman had simply ceased to exist after November 1841. She locked the cabinet and returned everything to its original position. Catherine was stirring, making small sounds of distress in her drugged sleep. Rose dampened a cloth and placed it on her forehead, and Catherine's eyes fluttered open. "Louisa," she whispered. "No, ma'am. It is Rose." Catherine's face contorted with grief. "I should have stopped her. I should have told her what I suspected. But I wanted to believe Father when he said it would be different with me, that Thomas would not, that I would be safe because I was less beautiful than my sister." Rose leaned closer, keeping her voice gentle. "What happened to Louisa, Mrs. Hartwell?" "They said she drowned. A terrible accident. Thomas took her for a carriage ride along the river on a beautiful autumn day, and she insisted on walking near the water despite the muddy banks. She slipped and fell, and the current took her before he could reach her. They found her body 3 miles downstream, tangled in tree roots. Everyone said how tragic it was, how devoted Thomas seemed in his grief. Father believed him completely, and 6 months later, Thomas asked to court me instead." Rose felt ice forming in her stomach. "You do not believe it was an accident?" "I was 15 when Louisa died. I grieved for 2 years, and then, when Thomas began calling on me, I found her diary. She had hidden it behind a loose brick in the fireplace of our shared bedroom. In it, she wrote about Thomas's growing possessiveness during their engagement, his jealousy when she spoke to other men, his insistence that she cut ties with her Charleston friends. She wrote that she was planning to end the engagement, that she feared him but did not know how to refuse him without causing scandal. Catherine's voice dropped to barely a whisper. The last entry was dated November 6th, 1841. She wrote, "Tomorrow Thomas is taking me to see the plantation lands he has purchased along the river. I will tell him there that I cannot marry him. I pray he will accept this with grace, but I fear otherwise. If anything should happen to me, let it be known that I did not go to that river willingly. You told your father?" "I tried. He said I was reading too much into a young woman's nervousness. He said Thomas had witnesses who confirmed it was an accident, that searching for conspiracy and tragedy would only cause pain. He burned the diary. Then he strongly suggested that I accept Thomas's courtship, as Louisa would have wanted her sister to find happiness, and our family's finances were such that an advantageous marriage was necessary." Rose understood the implications immediately. Catherine had been sold to her sister's possible murderer to settle debts and maintain social standing. And she had lived with this knowledge for 10 years, bearing Thomas's children, managing his household, maintaining the pretense of a successful marriage. "Why are you telling me this now?" Rose asked. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Because you look so much like her. The same coloring, the same features. Thomas saw it immediately when he purchased you. I knew what it meant. He is creating a replacement, a version of Louisa he can control completely. One who cannot refuse him, cannot leave him, cannot threaten his image. And when he tires of you, or when you become dangerous to his reputation, you will disappear just as Louisa did." Rose wanted to dismiss this as the paranoid fantasy of a woman driven to instability by years of suspicion and fear, but she could not. She had felt Thomas Hartwell's eyes on her, had seen the way he positioned her in isolation, had noted the unusual privileges that separated her from every other enslaved person on the estate. She was not a slave in the traditional sense of the word. She was something worse, a living doll, crafted to fulfill an obsession rooted in murder. Over the following weeks, Rose continued caring for Catherine while quietly investigating the Hartwell family history. She had learned that information existed in unexpected places, and that enslaved people often knew more about white families' secrets than the families themselves realized. Dinah, the older house slave who managed the kitchen, had worked at Hartwell Plantation since Thomas's father was alive. She remembered Louisa's single visit to the estate before her death. "Pretty girl," Dinah said one afternoon as she kneaded bread dough, her gnarled hands working with practiced efficiency. Nervous, though, kept looking around like she expected something bad to happen. Master Thomas was all attention and smiles, but I seen that kind of smile before. My first master had it, right before he sold my children. "Did you see them together? Did he seem angry with her?" Dinah glanced toward the door to ensure privacy. "I was serving refreshments in the parlor when they spoke. Miss Louisa said something about wanting more time before the wedding, maybe waiting until spring instead of December. Master Thomas got very still. That is when I knew she was in danger. Men like him, they do not hear the word no very well. And the day she died, he came back alone, soaking wet, screaming for help. Said she had fallen in the river. The men searched for hours. When they found her, her dress was torn, like maybe she had fought against something, or someone. But the doctor said drowning does terrible things to a body, and nobody questioned it further. Rose also spoke with Fisher, the overseer, though she had to be careful. German immigrants occupied a strange position in Georgia society. They were white and thus accorded certain privileges, but they were also foreign and therefore suspect. Fisher was more willing to speak candidly than a southern-born overseer might have been. "Mr. Hartwell gave me very specific instructions when I was hired," Fisher told her one morning as she passed near the barn where he was supervising repairs. "I was never to allow Miss Rose to work in the fields, never to discipline her, never to permit any of the male slaves to approach her cabin. He said this was because of her refined nature, but I have worked many plantations. These instructions, they are not about refinement. They are about possession. Has he done this before? Kept an enslaved woman separate like this?" Fisher's weathered face showed discomfort. "There was another woman before you came. She lived in the same cabin for almost a year. Then one day, Mr. Hartwell said she had been sold to a plantation in Alabama. But I never saw any bill of sale, and when I mentioned her to the slave trader who comes through, he said he had handled no such transaction. I did not ask further questions. In this work, some questions are dangerous." Rose felt the weight of this revelation. She was not the first. There had been another woman, someone who resembled Louisa enough to serve Thomas's obsession, and that woman had vanished without a trace. At night, in the small room adjacent to Catherine's, Rose wrote down everything she had learned. Her journal had grown thick with notes, observations, fragments of conversation. She was building a case, though she was not yet certain what she would do with it. Enslaved people had no recourse to law. They could not testify against white owners in court. Any revelation she might make would be dismissed as lies invented by an ungrateful slave. and she would be sold or worse. But Rose had learned something important during her years of bondage. Power was not always about physical force or legal authority. Sometimes power lay in information, in knowing what others wished to keep hidden, in understanding how to make secrets dangerous to those who held them. Catherine's condition began to improve, though Rose suspected this was due less to medicine than to their conversations. Catherine was unburdening herself of years of suppressed horror, and each conversation seemed to lift some of the weight from her shoulders. "I have tried to be a good wife," Catherine said one afternoon as Rose brushed her hair. "I have given him children, managed his house, entertained his associates. I thought if I could be perfect enough, he would forget about Louisa. But I see now that I was never the one he wanted. I was merely the one he could control after Louisa refused him. Have you ever thought of leaving?" Catherine laughed bitterly. "Where would I go? A married woman has no legal existence separate from her husband. He controls all money, all property. If I left, he would simply retrieve me, and my children would be raised to believe their mother was insane. I am as much his property as you are, Rose. The only difference is that society pretends otherwise." This was the truth that plantation mistresses rarely admitted aloud. Their own bondage, gilded and perfumed though it might be, was still bondage. They were decorative additions to their husbands' estates, valued for their ability to produce legitimate heirs and maintain social appearances, but ultimately as disposable as any other possession. Rose was considering this parallel when Richard Hartwell knocked on his mother's door. Thomas's son had grown into a lean young man of 14, with his father's sharp features and his mother's blonde hair. He had been taught to view enslaved people as tools, but Rose had noticed him watching her with an expression that suggested uncomfortable awareness of her humanity. "Mother wishes to see you," he told Rose, his voice formal. "Father has returned from Augusta and requests your presence in his study." Rose descended the stairs with a calm she did not feel. Whatever Thomas wanted, it would not be benign. He was sitting behind his mahogany desk when she entered, examining a ledger with apparent interest. He did not look up immediately, a power play she recognized. "Rose," he finally said, closing the ledger. "Doctor, Winthrop tells me that Catherine is much improved. He credits your attentive care." "Thank you, sir. He also tells me that Catherine has been speaking more freely, that the medicines seem to have loosened her tongue." His eyes fixed on Rose's face. "I wonder what she might have said during these conversations." Rose kept her expression neutral. "She speaks of many things, sir. Often her words are confused. The doctor says this is normal during recovery from nervous disorders." "I am certain that is true." Thomas stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "You are an intelligent woman, Rose. More intelligent than most in your position. That is both valuable and dangerous. Intelligence without the wisdom to know when to remain silent can lead to unfortunate consequences." The threat was clear, though wrapped in civilized language. "I understand, sir. Do you?" He turned to face her. "I wonder. You see, I have made inquiries about your background. The man who sold you at that estate sale provided interesting information. You were educated in a northern household, were you not? A Quaker family in Philadelphia who believed in teaching their servants to read and write. Most irregular." Rose said nothing, but her heart was pounding. She had never spoken of her time in Philadelphia, of the family who had treated her almost as a daughter before financial ruin forced them to sell her south. That history was supposed to be buried. "These Quakers," Thomas continued, "they fill slaves' heads with dangerous ideas. Equality, freedom, rights. Ideas that have no place in a properly ordered society. I paid a premium price for you, Rose, because of your refinement and appearance. But if I believed you were carrying northern agitation into my household, spreading discontent among my property, or filling my wife's head with fanciful notions, well, I would consider that price a poor investment." He moved closer, and Rose could smell cologne and tobacco on him. "Catherine's sister died in a tragic accident. That is the only truth that matters. If my wife has suggested otherwise, it is merely her illness speaking. And if you were to repeat such suggestions to anyone at all, I would be forced to conclude that you are an ungrateful and dangerous element on this plantation. Do you understand what happens to dangerous elements, Rose? Yes, sir. Good. He returned to his desk and picked up the ledger again, dismissing her with a gesture. You may return to your duties. Rose climbed the stairs slowly, her mind working through implications. Thomas knew she had been questioning people. He had likely spoken with Dinah and Fisher, possibly threatening them to learn what they had told her. He was tightening his control, making clear that any attempt to expose him would be met with violence. But in doing so, he had also confirmed Catherine's story. An innocent man would not need to deliver such threats. An innocent man would not track down Rose's background to find vulnerabilities he could exploit. Thomas Hartwell was guilty, and he was growing desperate. That night, Rose could not sleep. She lay in the small room adjacent to Catherine's, listening to the old house settle and creak around her. Through the thin wall, she could hear Catherine breathing, deep and regular for the first time in weeks. Around 2 in the morning, Rose heard footsteps in the hallway. She remained perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped outside Catherine's door. A long silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. Then the footsteps retreated, descending the stairs with careful quietness. Rose waited 5 minutes before rising. She moved to the window and looked down at the yard. A figure was crossing toward the slave cabins, carrying a lantern that bobbed in the darkness. Even from this distance, she recognized Thomas Hartwell's silhouette. He was going to her cabin. Rose felt fear twist in her stomach. What was he looking for? Had he decided to search her belongings while she was sleeping in the main house? If he found her journal with all its observations and notes, she would be dead by morning. She had to get there first. Rose slipped from the room and descended the back stairs, the ones used by house slaves. The night was warm and humid, thick with the smell of magnolia blossoms and something darker underneath. The swamp smell that rose from the river bottomland. Cicadas sang in waves, providing cover for her movement. She reached her cabin just as Thomas was lifting the latch. He had not yet lit the interior lamp, was still standing in the doorway with his lantern raised. Rose had seconds to decide her approach. If she confronted him, she would be punished for leaving the main house without permission. If she remained hidden, she would not know what he discovered. She chose a third option. "Mr. Hartwell?" she called from the darkness, as if she had just emerged from one of the other cabins. "Is something wrong, sir?" Thomas spun toward her voice, his face a mask of anger that transformed quickly into forced calm. "Rose, what are you doing out here?" "I woke and realized I had forgotten my needlework in the cabin. Mrs. Hartwell will want it in the morning. I did not wish to disturb you by asking permission at such an hour. It was a weak excuse, but it established her presence as innocent routine rather than surveillance." Thomas studied her face, searching for deception. "I see. Well, I came to ensure your cabin was secure. We have had reports of prowlers in the area. I wanted to verify all locks were functioning properly. This was obviously false. Slave cabins did not have locks, and wealthy planters did not inspect security measures at 2 in the morning. But they were both performing now, maintaining pretenses that barely concealed their mutual awareness of a deeper game. That is very thoughtful, sir. As you can see, everything appears normal." Thomas stepped away from the door. "Indeed. Return to the main house immediately. And in future, if you need something from your cabin, ask permission during daylight hours. It is not safe for women to be out alone at night." "Yes, sir." Rose walked back toward the main house, feeling his eyes on her until she rounded the corner. Only then did she allow herself to tremble. That had been close, too close. If she had been 30 seconds slower, he would have found the journal. But the encounter had revealed something important. Thomas was actively searching for evidence of her investigation. He had not yet found her journal, but he was looking. The situation was accelerating toward crisis. Rose entered the main house through the kitchen door and climbed back to the small room. Catherine was awake, sitting up in bed with an expression of fear. "I heard footsteps," she whispered. "Was it Thomas?" "Yes, he went to my cabin." Catherine's face went pale. "He knows you are asking questions. Rose, you must stop. He will kill you. I have seen this pattern before. When he feels threatened, he acts quickly. That is how Louisa died. She told him she would not marry him, and within 24 hours, she was dead. Please, I cannot watch this happen again." Rose sat on the edge of Catherine's bed, breaking every rule of proper conduct between mistress and slave. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need you to tell me everything you remember about the day Louisa died. Every detail, no matter how small." Catherine wiped tears from her face. "Why? What good will it do?" "Because knowledge is power, even for people like me. Especially for people like me. If something happens to me, if I disappear like that other woman Fisher mentioned, I need someone to know the truth. And you need someone to believe you are not insane." Catherine was silent for a long moment. Then she began to speak, her voice steady despite her fear. "Louisa came to visit the plantation in November 1841. Thomas wanted her to see her future home before the wedding. Father and I accompanied her. It was not proper for an engaged woman to travel alone with her betrothed. We stayed 3 days. On the 3rd day, Thomas suggested he take Louisa on a carriage ride to see the full extent of the property, including the riverlands he had recently purchased. Father agreed, as Thomas was nearly family. I wanted to go with them, but Thomas said he wished to speak privately with Louisa about their future. Father thought this romantic. I thought it ominous, but I was only 15 and had no authority to object. Catherine's hands twisted the bedclothes. They left mid-morning. Father and I remained at the house, expecting them to return by dinner. When late afternoon came with no sign of them, Father became concerned. We were about to send men searching when Thomas appeared, stumbling into the house, soaking wet and incoherent with apparent grief. He said Louisa had insisted on walking near the river despite his warnings about the muddy bank. She had slipped on wet leaves and fallen in. The current was strong from recent rains. Thomas said he jumped in after her but could not reach her in time. The water swept her away. You did not believe him? Not entirely. Thomas's clothes were wet, yes, but they were also torn in several places. He had scratches on his face and hands that looked more consistent with a struggle than a rescue attempt. And when he described Louisa's fall, he said she had screamed his name as she went under. But Louisa was an excellent swimmer. Our family spent summers at the shore, and she swam in the ocean without fear. It seemed unlikely that she would drown in a river, even a swift one, unless something prevented her from swimming. What did your father say? He accepted Thomas's account completely. Men searched the riverbanks and found Louisa's body the next morning, miles downstream. The doctor confirmed death by drowning. There was no evidence of foul play, he said. The funeral was held in Charleston, and Thomas played the devastated fiancé beautifully. 6 months later, he began courting me, and Father encouraged the match. He said Thomas deserved happiness after such tragedy, and that I should not let my sister's accident prevent me from securing a good marriage. Rose thought about this timeline. Did anyone examine the place where Louisa supposedly fell? Father and some of the men went there the next day. They said the bank was indeed muddy and treacherous, and there were signs of someone sliding into the water, but no one looked closely enough to see if those marks could have been made by a body being pushed rather than accidentally falling. And no one thought to question why Thomas emerged with scratches and torn clothing. Thomas said he had torn his clothes on tree branches while trying to save her, that he had scratched himself climbing down the bank. It was plausible enough that no one pursued it further, and I think Father did not want to pursue it. Our family's finances were poor. We needed the marriage connection. If Thomas was guilty of murdering Louisa, it would mean scandal and lost opportunity. Better to believe in tragic accident. The coldness of this calculation struck Rose with physical force. Catherine's own father had chosen to potentially sacrifice one daughter to save the family's social position, and then had offered up his second daughter to the same man.